nationalism can be good, it can be bad, it can be indifferent. It depends on how the powers or the people define it and seek to use it, pursue it. And that, I think, is where the new nationalism is more dangerous, because it is emphasizing other, it is emphasizing ethnic divisions, it is generated or motivated around excluding others and seeing others as challenges or threats. As I mentioned, in Canada, we've been through 10 years of that. We had debates, efforts by our government to put in place a policy to ban the niqab, efforts by our government to put in place a snitch line. Do you know what that means? Like an informant line for people to call the government if they saw anti-cultural values and behaviors going on in the neighborhoods. We managed to get away from that, but we're seeing that rising. And most recently, if you follow the elections in Europe, the election in Austria, we have a conservative party that's been voted in Austria, and the party that they appear to be most likely, and maybe they've done it already, to ally with is the far-right party that was founded by a former SS officer. And their leaders have explicitly said they want to get away from the European Union. So they might drive Austria to be the next Brexit, Nexit, if you want. Yeah, Austria. A very fine-looking young man, the leader of the party that was just got the majority vote, 31, 32 years old, I think he is, the youngest leader who's won an election for a national election in Austria. But he is a conservative, and his ally is a far right, the FPO, that has said they want to ban immigration, and they think that the EU integration agenda is madness, a super state. So that's a dangerous sign. But it's not the only place where that kind of nationalism has been emerging. Finland, where I spent a chunk of time as a child. Obviously Germany, we've seen growth in the far-right parties, Poland, Hungary, too many to count. What is behind that, and this is an interesting thing, I think, Trump in the United States is a symptom as much as a cause. You know, we talk about the negligent hegemony of the international capitalist system that leaves too many people behind, that creates too many poor jobs, that creates too much dislocation for ordinary working people, that appears to be moving jobs away from, this is the frustration from Europe, for Europe and the United States, losing jobs, etc., etc. Now these are mostly, to my mind, with an English background, scared and angry middle class and declining middle class white people. But nationalism like that isn't unique to Europe either. I do a lot of work in Japan, and we see under Shinzo Abe a move towards a nationalist view on Japanese relations. We see Mr. Modi in India with a strong ethnic and nationalist identity, voter base behind him. So this kind of frustration with the dislocation of people's lives, I think, is something that has been neglected by an international economic system that has been around at least since Reagan was voted in, Reagan and Thatcher. So 35 years of this has created the space for this kind of an angry vote, which has been triggered in Europe also by violence and conflict and large-scale immigration that Europeans feel is out of their control. And Trump certainly, I saw today that they're putting up 7 or 8 different versions of the Trump wall to test them close to the Mexican border. Is that right? You know, this is the kind of expression of this sort of angry nationalism that I see. Now, how does that translate into challenges for multilateralism and for the UN? I'm sure many of you will know that the United States recently announced that it was pulling out of UNESCO. It still wants to attend meetings, but it's pulling out as a member. It's not the first time it's done that. It did that earlier as well. It ripped up, or this president ripped up the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. They announced that they're leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. He praised the Brexit vote because he thinks that the EU is a huge bureaucracy, which it is. But he also attacked European allies in NATO for not giving enough of their resources to Western security. He seemed unaware that Puerto Rico was an island. That was a curious one. Never mind. Less reported in all of these is that the US also recently rejected the request or the recommendation by the World Bank that it should increase its capital funding by $75 billion, which is money that it could, not to get that from the United States, but that the US and the lenders, those who support the World Bank, would stand behind, would guarantee the World Bank as it went into international capital markets to raise $75 billion extra to support developing loans to developing countries. In fact, the US Treasury Secretary said that the World Bank should throw out several of the developing countries. There's too many of them seeking loans. The result of that may be that a lot of those countries will go and look to China and look for loans from China instead of looking to loans from the international organization, which essentially is run by the United States. How does that translate into specifically the UN? We just had, I don't know how many people particularly follow the UN. We had our new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, former President of Portugal, and a long-established and well-experienced person inside of the UN system, elected in a new and fairly unique, although not democratic, process of election to the Secretary General ship. And many in the UN, at least, were, and I'm not, I'm an academic, so I'm just making sure you understand I'm not here speaking on behalf of the UN. Many people in the UN who had felt that our previous Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, a very charming man, nonetheless was far too quiet and far too uninspiring as a leader for the international organization. Many wanted Guterres to be that new person, to speak out, if you want, speak truth to power. That's what people have been looking for him to do. He certainly knows the UN system. He has certainly, in June, announced reforms, a reform agenda that is much needed, a bureaucratic reform agenda that is much needed inside of the UN system to rationalize, to put responsibility and accountability together, to break up the power of the UN Development Program, UNDP, and put the UN Development Group under the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, and then try to put the resident coordinator job separate from UNDP to try to put more of the UN's goals into what the UN is going to do on the ground. Those are good and admirable attempts to address some of the bureaucratic issues that need to be addressed inside of the UN. But this is where I think the quiet power of the, sometimes quiet power of the UN, Nikki Haley is actually reasonably well respected in UN circles, even if Trump isn't, certainly much more so than John Bolton was. The quiet power that the UN has possibly exerted over the Secretary General. And this was a very disappointing statement. At September 18th, the Secretary General said, and this is a quotation, "Someone recently asked what keeps me up at night. My answer was simple: bureaucracy. Fragmented structures, Byzantine procedures, endless red tape. Someone out to undermine the UN could not have come up with a better way to do it than by imposing some of the rules that we have created ourselves. I even sometimes ask myself whether there was a conspiracy to make our rules exactly what they need to be for us not to be effective." That was a bitter pill to swallow for many young UN officers who are working extremely hard in the field in very difficult circumstances, who also know that a great deal of the limitations, a great deal of the rules that have been created around the UN system and the UN bureaucracy are really imposed on them by member states and their interests, and not by the UN itself. The phrase that the Secretary General used, value for money while advancing shared values. Value for money, okay, I'll come to that one. While advancing shared values, I'm not sure which values it is that we're intending to share. Certainly not the values of the new nationalism or the values of Donald Trump. To put some of that into context, and I'll do this bit, and then I'll stop and ask for some questions if you have any. To put value for money into perspective, we were just chatting. I was here 2 years ago giving a talk, and I remember at that time when the UN's peacekeeping budget was the largest it had ever been, which was a little over $8 billion, and the UN's regular budget is about $2.7, $2.8 billion per year. What I explained to people was that the UN's budget was less than the combined budgets of the New York police and fire departments put together. Just New York City, not New York State, just New York City police and fire departments. And that the UN's total number of employees was less than the New York police and fire department's total number of employees put together, which put some of that into perspective. Or the entire UN's budget, including peacekeeping at its record highest, was the equivalent of the defense budget of Singapore. Again, to put that into perspective, value for money. Another way to look at it, which I think ties in, interesting figures that come out, that ties into the kind of anger that voters also may feel, though. Not to connect the two, but to give you a comparison. Now, because the UN is in the middle of closing down 3 of its peacekeeping operations. The operation in Liberia closes early next year. The operation in Haiti closed this month. And the operation in Cote d'Ivoire closed in the middle of this year. Because of those closures, the UN is actually achieving the cuts in the peacekeeping budget that the Trump administration is asking for. I guess they didn't know those things were happening, or Nikki Haley maybe fed it in. But with that reduction in the UN's overall budget, the total budget, full budget assessed and peacekeeping of the UN for this year and next year is about $9 billion, 8.6, $8.7 billion. To put that into perspective, the bonus pool, bonuses, not salaries, the bonus pool on Wall Street last year was $24 billion. So $9 billion for all of the UN's operations around the world, as compared to $24 billion in bonuses on Wall Street last year. Or the annual food waste, we chatted about this earlier, the annual food waste amount in the United States, and I'm not particularly picking on them, just because the pressure on the budget cuts has come from the Trump administration. I'm using this as an example. Annual food waste in the US is estimated at about $220 billion a year. Just in the USA. So is the US pouring money into the UN, and is the UN not giving value for money? Those are interesting questions that would be nice. I would love to find out tomorrow that Guterres had a blow-up in the White House and that they had a big argument. My concern is that the Secretary General is going to push the bureaucratic reforms and not address the power issues that are still there. Because he's concerned that perhaps the US will cut more budgets, perhaps the US will want to do more things that will damage the UN or damage multilateralism. Worth considering, given Guterres' background, which is in humanitarian affairs and human rights. The current global humanitarian appeal for all of the humanitarian disasters around the world is only about 40% funded. It's 60% unfunded, which is the lowest it has been for about 15 to 20 years. We have more refugees and more internally displaced persons than we've had in post-war history, but the appeal for humanitarian assistance is the lowest it's been in a couple of decades. So, someone, from a UN perspective, what does this mean for the UN? Someone, I think, needs to lead a rules-based system, and somebody needs to stand up in front of the challenges that a multilateral system, the UN, is facing from new nationalisms. Trump certainly is a voice. Trump is an enabler of some kinds of new nationalism, but he's also a symptom of frustration with the nature of neglect of many people. Kofi Annan did speak out in a lot of ways. He became a vocal champion, although he was then punished for doing so. And maybe Guterres is deciding in his first year as Secretary General he can't afford to do that. But if he doesn't, I think the UN will lose as much credibility as it might do if the Security Council continues to fail. If the Security Council fails, I had a great discussion over dinner, I don't know if David's here, and when we talked about Security Council failures, I said, you're right, remember the Security Council is a room with a set of rules, but it's member states. So the Security Council is 15 member states who fail to do things in a room called the Security Council. One can blame that, but if the Secretary General does not stand up for a multilateral rules-based institution in the face of pressures, then I don't know who will. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news is lots of opportunities for things to get better. When you're down about as low as you think, there's hopefully one place to go, and that's up. So that said, I'm happy to take questions or comments from anybody on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edgar. Well, this is a very important issue. I'm more than sure that many of you will be willing to ask questions. So if there is anyone, just let us know your name and the institution you are coming from.
Hello, good evening. My name is Eduardo Palacios. I have had my master's degree on People's Friendship University of Russia. It's more a commentary. I think that we're now living in a globalized world, but we don't have to give up our nationalism. I mean, we don't want to give up our borders. We don't want to give up our language. We don't want to give up our culture or religion, etc. I can tell you that because I lived in a building with people from 50 different countries, and it's not easy. People from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from India, from Russia itself, from Ukraine, Mexico, Colombia, and I can keep going. It's not easy to live all together in the same place. It's really difficult. On the speeches, it sounds really good. We can all live together, we can share, we can be tolerant, we can respect each other, but it's not easy. I think we were going too fast, and we are now realizing what a globalized world really means. And not everybody likes it. Not everybody likes it. That's why there are some sectors of specific countries that are taking back this speech about, no, we have to protect ourselves. And it's a contradiction itself. We have to close the borders, build walls, stop migration, don't take foreign religions. And I think we have to, at the same time, also make a reflection about this. Because globalization is not really easy. Living all together is not really easy. I can tell you from my own experience. This is a process that will take centuries, I believe, when The day will come when we'll have a unified human civilization. Not American, not European, a human civilization. A civilization of the planet Earth. Maybe we still have ahead millennia to achieve that goal. We were going too fast. Now we are realizing what a globalized world means, and we don't like it completely. That's my commentary. Thank you.
Yeah, in many, when I'm teaching classes and I'm talking about integration to my students, like it's a good thing, I say to them, have you ever gotten to know somebody and the more you get to know them, you realize you really don't like them? Okay, it happens. And it can happen in all kinds of different ways. I don't think nationalism is a bad thing. That's a thing earlier. It can be a very healthy thing in the right way, obviously. Nationalism can also be a very dangerous force when people want to use it for destructive purposes. Fake patriotism, I guess you could say in some ways. The way we describe the difference in Canada and, well, Michael Ignatieff, I don't know if people read Michael Ignatieff, but I've seen it elsewhere, the difference between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Civic nationalism in Canada is a very multicultural country, and there are frustrations with that, sure. But you have a sense of nationalism if you will, respect the Constitution. These are where the problems come, perhaps. Respect the Constitution, respect a way of life, everybody get on together, or, so that kind of a nationalism, we're Canadian, or a different kind of nationalism, you're Indian, not Canadian, you're Chinese, not Canadian, you're Vietnamese, not Canadian, that ethnic nationalism. And yes, too much, too far, too fast, I think unregulated capitalism, unregulated liberal capitalism, not liberalism per se, I think, but liberal capitalism has dislocated a lot of people who are very frustrated and frightened. And that's certainly the case in Finland. It has been the case in the UK. It's been the case in a lot of Europe, exacerbated then by conflicts that have pushed people out. So they see waves of immigrants coming in as a new kind of threat, economic immigrants, but dislocated immigrants coming in as refugees, and they see this worsening the situation that they've felt. So yeah, I mean, nationalism can be very healthy. I'm not sure we'll ever get to one human thing. You're saying maybe I don't see secular progress or theological progress, but secular progress in that direction as necessary or inevitable. I think you can have very healthy nationalism, but understand what kind of nationalism you're trying to have.
Thank you very much. Por acá habían levantado la mano.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm Adrián Murillo. I'm from ANUAL University of Mexico City. And well, you were talking about the neglective hegemony of the United States and how that it's suicide, and that some countries are recurring to China so they can get away from this suicide of the United States. Do you think that this leaves the way for a new Chinese hegemony dominating the global system, or that the emerging multipolarity of this system will not allow China to have a hegemony over it? I don't know if I phrased it okay.
I'll ask them next month when I'm there. They may not answer me though. Well, inside, I don't know about on the global scale, but certainly, because China still portrays itself also as a developing country. Whenever you talk to a Chinese ambassador at the UN and you say, you guys are really rich compared to a lot of countries, so maybe you should give more money, they say, oh, we're a developing country. We take money, we don't give it out. But they certainly can move into space, empty space that's left by others. There was a joke at one point that if you looked at the P5, the permanent five on the Security Council, and you saw Vladimir Putin, and you saw Theresa May, and you see Donald Trump sitting there, then the liberal is China. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Inside of the peacekeeping system, this is one that these are the kind of little things that are relatively little things I see. The West, the United States does not do peacekeeping for obvious reasons, as Russia doesn't do usually UN peacekeeping. It's too controversial. But most of the rest of the West has essentially withdrawn from peacekeeping. They don't provide troops. So the biggest troop contributing countries, not money, but troops, people who bleed and die for peacekeeping, are Bangladesh and Nepal and India and developing world countries. But China recently made a very interesting announcement. China said it would provide 8,000 troops, a standing force of 8,000 troops as a rapid reaction force for the UN. That would put it immediately as the largest single troop contributing country to UN peacekeeping in the world. And they can certainly do it, and they do mean it. They're working towards that end. And they're pushing for, because power comes with your commitments, more power inside of the UN system. They wanted the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. They didn't get it, but they wanted it under Chinese leadership under Gutierrez. So they certainly can fill voids that somebody else is leaving behind. And if I'm in a country that desperately needs well-equipped, well-trained, very capable, highly mobile peacekeepers to keep me alive, and the country that will provide it is China, I'll take it. So they certainly could step into the space in there, maybe global financial leadership, but at the same time, others may see China looking to take more control and decide, no, they're going to invest their money and put more into it. The US just announced, was it $54 billion increase in the defense budget? $54 billion Donald Trump added to the US defense budget because they don't spend enough. They can pour money wherever they want to if they feel that they need to. But China certainly is interested in stepping up, and other countries are looking to China to do it. African countries are looking for Chinese investment for the sustainable development goals, because the World Bank's not going to be doing it.
My name is Fernando Vizcaíno. I'm professor at the National University of Mexico. I would like to know your opinion about independence process in Catalonia.
Okay, but I can certainly give you my opinion, but all I know is probably less than anybody else. I'm old enough that I do remember previous iterations of separatism in Spain and in other countries as well. So it's not a new. I don't necessarily associate some kinds of independence demands with the rise of new nationalism, because some of them have been around for a while. But from what I have seen, and here I'll defer to my friend and colleague Modesto, who knows a lot more. Spain has a constitution in place, and the vote in Catalonia was 90% in favor of that constitution. So people can look to change a constitution. That's different from a unilateral declaration of independence. The context I would put it in would be mine, in Canada. We had a referendum to break up Canada. The Parti Québécois wanted a referendum on independence, and they got a referendum on independence. They didn't declare unilateral independence, they got a national referendum on independence, and it was a close vote. But the vote was to remain inside of Canada, and the separatist effort in Quebec, which was alive for several decades, essentially petered out after they had that proper constitutional referendum. So, do I support unilateral declarations of separation? No. If you're not in a country that is being, where your people are being, actively hunted down and murdered or something like that. If you're in a constitution where you have power and you want to do something that might change the nature of that constitution, then I think you go through that process. If you want to be legitimate. That doesn't mean a government response that's heavy-handed is legitimate either. Yeah?
You can keep
Oh, okay.
Good evening. My name is Luis Emanuel Dominguez from the Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara. And at the beginning of your talk, you said that a reform in the United Nations is very needed. I would like to hear your point of view and the point of view of the Academic Council of the United Nations system, more specific about the reform needed in the Security Council.
Sure. Let me do that political thing. I speak with my own hat on, not as a representative of my organization. But actually do that for a real reason. Does the association that you're all here for have a person who can speak authoritatively on behalf of all of you and reflect all of your opinions? Probably not. And I certainly can't do that. ACONS has 4,500 plus members who have widely divergent views. So let me put my professor hat on and speak in answer to that one, okay? It would be fair to say many people share similar views to mine, but I don't speak on behalf of the association. The Security Council, is it outdated in its membership, in its numbers? Yes. Is it no longer representative of the number of states and interests in the world? Of course. It's grown once. It grew from 11 to 15, but it's essentially still what it was in 1945 in terms of structure. Is the veto power of the permanent five archaic? Yes. In my view, probably for two of those five, France and Britain. And bear in mind, I've got an English accent, so I'm criticizing myself. But what people, when you have a long sentence with the word "but" in the middle, nothing really matters until everything that comes after the word "but," right? The Security Council has changed in a lot of different ways that people don't pay attention to, because it's not numbers and it's not veto. 10 of the 15 members of the Security Council are elected members. Those elected members, every member of the Security Council gets to be president of the council by alphabetical listing for 1 month, and they each serve as a 2-year term. So all of those 10 get to serve as president of the Security Council, and when they're president of the Security Council, if they so choose, they can make statements, they can hold thematic debates, they can bring the council to different places to visit crises in the field. So they have a great deal of procedural or process power inside of the Security Council that people don't pay attention to. During the Cold War, that wasn't really exercised very much because you were on one side or another of the Cold War. But since the end of the Cold War, the Security Council has looked at far more themes, topics, not just individual country crises, but themes like human security, human rights, climate as a security threat. So it's looked at far more themes than ever before. They can also issue presidential statements, which are not the same as a Security Council resolution, but they're taken to be more authoritative in some ways than just an ordinary debate, a presidential statement from the Security Council. Canada's last term, which actually was 20 years ago now, the creation of the Kimberley, the Blood Diamonds certification scheme, which led to UNITA signing on to the peace agreement, in Angola, which led to the end of the war in Angola, came about because Canada was president of the Security Council and was president of the Sanctions Committee and pushed the agenda to embarrass countries that supported Joseph Savimbi and supported Blood Diamonds. And they got De Beers diamonds on their side because they didn't want to hurt their sales. So inside of the processes of the Security Council, since the end of the Cold War, there's been a lot more change taking place than anybody actually really pays attention to. Many of the positive things that have happened that way. That does not mean that when a big issue that is considered to be vital to a P5 member, that can be pushed through an agenda. It can't. The veto is still there and the P5 is still there. So when the Canada pushed for Chechnya to be put onto the agenda, Russia said no. When Canada pushed for Kosovo to be put on the agenda, Russia said no. You know, and the US does the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. Primarily those two, not the other three, really. So there are some limits to that change, but there is a lot more that takes place, that comes out of the Council than people actually give it, if you want, give it credit for. The flip side of that, as I always say to people, is if you make a Council of 15 bigger, are you making it better or just giving more forms of paralysis, more national interests? If India and, I'll just pick a bunch of countries, India and Brazil and Japan and Germany and whoever, big countries become members of the Security Council, are they going to be altruistic or are they going to import their own interests into the Council, and will those just make it even more paralyzed? So there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of the Council that people don't pay attention to, and while we push for changes, we don't think of whether those changes will actually make the Council more efficient and effective. It may make it more representative, but that's not the same thing. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Oh, that's great. Anybody else? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mariana Perez Vargas. I'm from the Faculty of Social and Political Science in UNAM. And, well, you told us that nationalism emphasizes differences. And I know that you already told us that bad nationalism, but I don't know if you're equating or equaling nationalism to racism. I think that it's important to recognize the differences. I mean, there's the context is different in European countries and in Canada and the United States from other countries that have a lot of diversity. And I think that the pluralism, we need to take that in account, because it's not that easy to well, we also have to see the history of the other countries. It's not the same. It's, I mean, the neocolonialism is important, and the pluralism and also the neocolonialism, it's not that easy to accept. I don't know if it's the right word, but there's a lot more than just Europe.
Apparently. Yeah, if I get it, you can tell me if I'm answering you or not, and feel free to tell me if I'm not. Yeah, I don't equate nationalism and racism. I thought I heard you say, was I equating nationalism and racism? Was that right? You can just say no. No? Sorry, could you give it the mic again? I just want to make sure I'm understanding. And you can tell me as well if you...
What I meant is that you told us that nationalism emphasizes differences,
Okay.
but in a bad way.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if it's
Yeah.
like
No,
that.
no, yeah, no, in that case, no, let me correct. No, I don't think nationalism is always bad. I think there are good kinds of nationalism, positive and constructive kinds of nationalism, and there are destructive kinds of nationalism. This original talk is also a very long academic piece, where, you know, as academics do, we define nationalism and all these different things. So I kind of scooched past all of that because I'm the last thing between you and the end of your day and a good drink somewhere, and I don't want to slow people down too much. But no, there are constructive kinds of nationalism. National identity and national unity is a good thing in many ways, and if you want to see what it looks like when we don't have that, look at countries that break apart, that don't have a strong national identity for different reasons. When people and countries splinter, it can be a violent process. Nationalism, if it is a pride in what your country represents and what your country can bring to other countries and to I'm putting this in the context of the UN and multilateralism. If what you bring is pride in your country and what your country can bring, and if your leaders then use that and look to be able to make agreements and compromises, knowing that you have to make compromises, you may lose some things in the short term to win longer things over the longer term, then nationalism is good, and the breakup of national identity can be dangerous and destructive. Where nationalism is a problem is what I see in some senses as a new kind of nationalism. It's not all new. I put inverted commas around mine because Japan was extremely nationalist around the 1930s and 40s, and so was Germany, and so was Italy, and so was Britain, etc., etc. And ethnic nationalism, where one is identifying others as dangerous to you, to your identity, to your safety, to your security, that kind of nationalism, I think, is dangerous because it leads to inter-ethnic conflict and inter-ethnic violence. When it's identity politics like that, that doesn't mean people necessarily pursue that. I'm well aware that I'm different from others in Canada or here, but that doesn't mean I feel threatened or dislike somebody. But it is something that is more easy to use by leaders. So in that case, Donald Trump is an enabler of a kind of vicious identity racism. He is supported by the KKK, he is supported by the alt-right, he is supported by Richard Spencer. They celebrate the things that he says. He says the folks in Charlottesville had good people. The good people were carrying Nazi banners. That's a dangerous kind of nationalism that feeds into a racism. And the UK vote, frankly, the Brexit vote, I hear a lot of us liberals, if you will, wanting to apologize for the frustrated people, saying, you know, they were just dislocated, economic dislocation, they lost their jobs, they're good people. Many of them are, but there's also, in the UK case of Brexit, a really strong 50-year-old plus white person racism that was behind that vote. Because the vote wasn't against, for them, it wasn't against Europe per se, it was against the immigrant challenge that Europe enabled and against immigrants already in the UK. That was what Nigel Farage was with the UK Independence Party, UKIP. Straight out racist party, a white supremacist party in the UK. So that kind of vote does exist in some of those nationalisms, and that's the dangerous one, but not nationalism as such. It can be good or bad.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Celeste. I'm a student of Universidad del Mar. First, welcome to Oaxaca, welcome to Huatulco, and welcome to Umar. And our question is, what is your opinion about the situation in North Korea? And what is the role of the United Nations, specifically Security Council, about this situation?
Well, thank you for the welcome here. And as a Canadian, I can tell you, it's so hot. But I'm pleased to be here, but it's so hot. The situation in North Korea. You know, there was almost a functioning agreement with North Korea under a previous American administration that was scuppered. The situation now is in some ways about as dangerous as it has been in 50 years, just because of the rhetoric, just because of the uncertainty. What I mean by that isn't that somebody necessarily wants to start a war, for example, but now here's a strange form of reasoning. If I was the North Korean leader and I saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi and I saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, I would think, what did they have, what did they not have? Oh, I know what. There is a, if you feel threatened by that massive military power, even if they don't really mean it, but you feel it, there's a logic behind wanting to have those weapons. Now, there's other logics behind him wanting to have those weapons of self-aggrandizement and other things, but there is a strategic logic that would lead me to say, I probably need those. What's dangerous then, of course, is if you have only a few of them and you're a relatively small target. This is going back to like 1970s and 80s deterrence theory. If you're geographically small and not very many in number, and you've got a power that has far more weapons of all kinds, the nuclear triad, air, sea, and land launched, then you may feel threatened and may feel like you need to use them. There's that horrible phrase, use it or lose it. The crisis response problem is what that creates. If something is uncertain, if you think somebody is launching, if you think somebody is about to, and you've got a 90-second window to get yours up in the air, you might do it. That danger of not deliberate but accidental conflict, I think, is one that worries me. Having said that, I don't think it's that close. I think it's an enormous war of words, because I have to think that the command and control system in the United States, at least, is far more elaborate. I don't know what it's like in North Korea, but the command and control system in the United States is far more elaborate than just Donald Trump pushing a button. If that was the case, I'd be digging a hole in the ground. But I think I have to think that it's a war of words more than it's going to be anything else. Where it hurts people is, for example, I think humanitarian access to North Korea. Where it hurts people is reunification of families that were divided between the two countries. People on the ground that had an opportunity to do more. I think that's been lost for, certainly for as long as Donald Trump's going to be in power, and maybe longer than that. So I don't think the military side of it is something that worries me too much, but what it does to US-China relations, what it does to confidence in American leadership in crisis situations, those I think are negative.
Anybody else to finish? No? Well, I would like to ask you, since I have the mic, I would like to ask you something. In this context of negligent hegemony, what is your opinion about the decision made by Donald Trump to leave UNESCO?
I don't think Donald Trump knows what UNESCO is. Just like he didn't know that he was the president of Puerto Rico, and he didn't know that Puerto Rico was an island with ocean water around it. So I don't think it was really not his decision in a sense of, I really know what UNESCO is. I disagree with its recognition of Palestine, because that was a controversial thing. You know, I disagree with its recognition of Palestine as a state because Palestine might use that to take a case to the International Criminal Court, you know, blah, blah, blah. I don't think there's anything like that behind his decision. I think certainly there are lobby groups that have pushed to get the United States out of UNESCO. It's done it before, and if a government changes as they tend to do in the United States, and a democratic government comes in, they'll rejoin UNESCO. Interestingly, this time, unlike last time, other governments are filling in the space. Just like when one of the first things he did, as Republican countries always do, Republican governments in the US always do, is say, we will no longer fund any organization that talks about family planning. So anything that will touch on the issue of abortion, the US will no longer fund in development aid. So that's happened under each of the last Republican governments, under Bush, under Reagan. It was reversed under Clinton and under Obama. But this time, when he cut that money, other countries said, Sweden said, and others, okay, well, you know what, we're not going to give our development aid to any organization that doesn't support women's right to choose. So other countries are filling in the money, and they've said, we'll do that. So will it hurt UNESCO? It'll hurt UNESCO some in its regular budget. Will it hurt UNESCO's programs? Far less than previously, because other governments, maybe China will give some, other governments are going to fill in the void, because they see this actually as important, as an opportunity. The US loses credibility, and that's a sad thing, because the US still is a major funder, and it should be a better example. So in that sense, it's too bad for UNESCO and too bad for the US. But in terms of programs, I don't think it'll hurt the way previous cuts have hurt. Yeah.
Finally, on behalf of the Mexican International Studies Association, I would like to give you this diploma for your participation in this conference. Thank you very much for being here. Have a good night and keep enjoying the Congress.